Whilst the Vikings are mostly famous for their attacks on foreign countries like England, France and Ireland, not even the Norse themselves were safe from their own kind. In the 10th century, western Iceland was haunted by a band of Vikings led by Óspak Kjallakson. Originally a farmer, Ospak took to traveling the coast and plundering his neighbors. He and his 30 supporters retired to a small wooden fort, where they held off their besiegers until Ospak died and his followers surrendered. So too were the pirates a threat on mainland Scandinavia. In the 11th to 13th centuries, Slavic pirates posed a huge threat to the Scandinavian Kingdoms. Neither were they safe from their own neighbors. The other kings might wish to expand their realms through conquest, and measures had to be implemented to safeguard the coastlines of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. Viking warfare, whether conducted by pirates or conquerors, was dependent on movement by water. Rivers were vital for transportation and communication in Scandinavia, so blocking them by sticking poles into the riverbed was a tried and tested method. The saga of Harald Fairhair tells of his invasion of western Geatland, located in modern Sweden. When spring came and the ice broke, the Geats stuck poles into the river, Göta Älv, so that King Harald could not bring his fleet inland. Harald moored his ships at the poles and proceeded to rove the shorelines and burn the nearby villages. The Geats assembled a desperate army and were defeated in battle. Archaeological evidence has been unearthed of these blockages, and the method seems to have been used as far back as the 3rd century AD, though they may have been the remnants of bridges and fishing traps. Blockages were usually surrounded by hill forts. These fortifications prevented the enemy from landing and raiding the nearby countryside, as quoted in the saga. A blockage was discovered on the Sigtuna River, located below 3 such hill forts. Some historians have likewise suggested that pole blockages were a symbolic way to mark borders, or for a small king to show his territorial authority. A system of watchmen were positioned along the water routes to alert the arrival of enemy forces. These watchmen were positioned at watchfires known as vårdkasar. These were strategically placed and within visible range of one another. So when an enemy fleet was spotted, the fires were quickly lit one by one, allowing a defense to be organized. Norwegian laws tells us that the guards should only light the fire if a fleet of at least 5 ships was approaching. The speed of these watchfires was 200 kilometers a night, meaning that an entire country could be alerted very quickly. According to Swedish laws, there were 3 levels of guards: an outer guard for watching the coast, an inner guard for watching the rivers leading to settled areas, and a village guard. If a guard failed in his duties, he was forced to pay a fine to the king, his local area, or to the people of the village. Guards were changed at sunrise. If the guard was unable to light the fire, he would cry out 3 alarm calls. He was likewise supposed to bring his own weapons. Defense was organized with a budkavli, some sort of small wooden object, sometimes carrying a written message. In Norway, a sort of arrow was used. These were carried by a runner from village to village, fort to fort, alerting the denizens of the imminent assault and mustering them for a defense. This system was likewise used for levying offensive forces, but also by peasants arming an uprising against their king. When news of an attack reached the king, he levied his people for Leithanger. Though I have discussed this in depth in a previous video, to summarize, the Leithanger was essentially a naval force, used for both defensive and offensive operations. This system of coastal defense would persist into the 14th century, when warfare had shifted to become more land-based, and ships became heavier. Inland rivers were turned into places of peaceful communication. The largest recorded sea battles involving Vikings occurred after the introduction of the Ledung in Norway. Whilst their battles abroad were fought in shield walls on land, Vikings preferred to duke it out at sea when fighting among themselves, most likely due to the size of Scandinavia and the hard terrain. Vikings were far from barbarians, and their organization in battle was seemingly quite complex. In particular, the Vikings used a system of visual signs that indicated their belonging and status. These included symbols and colors painted on shields, parts of the ship, banners, and weather vanes. Viking fleets consisted of various longships and smaller cargo ships used for transporting provisions. The king led the fleet from his royal flagship, usually the largest and most heavily decorated. His ship was distinguished by the merki, roughly meaning mark, as in a sign. Believed to have been a banner, it makes frequent appearance in skaldic poetry, and we can see one depicted on the Bayeux Tapestry, flying from the mast of Duke William's ship. Some believe it was also flown from the prow of the ship. It was considered a great honor to hold the banner, and a show of victory when wrestled from the enemy. Below the king's flagship were the ships belonging to his lieutenants, jarls and powerful chieftains. These ships would have been followed by the ships from their respective regions. The leading ships of the fleet distinguished themselves with weather vanes. These were made from bronze or gold, and contrary to the name, evidence points to them being unfit for navigation or measuring the wind. They could also be taken down and used as merki, banners on the battlefield. This wooden engraving from the 13th century shows what they may have looked like. It is also believed that they had a heraldic purpose, displaying either the symbol of the chieftain they belonged to, or the region in which they came from. Birds seem to have been popular symbols used to distinguish Vikings from a certain area. For example, one Swedish historian discovered that the rooster was frequently depicted on runic inscriptions in the parishes of Öster and Västerhaninge. Haninge is an ancient name and would stem from hane, a type of rooster. Other such examples exist in Sweden, where places have been named after birds, and the said bird appearing on local runestones. Such birds include crows, double falcons, and hawks. These symbols would have created a shared identity for the crew of a ship to rally beneath, and would have been used along with regional colors. These symbols and colors are believed to have been reflected in the crew's clothing, jewelry, and most prominently, their merki. They could also have been painted on the sails, or even along the sides of the ship. Shields were a vital part of shipboard allegiance and symbolism. In a sea battle between Harald Fairhair and Kjotve the Rich, Harald's ships were distinguished by red shields and black oars, while Kjotve's fleet had white shields. One of the Viking ships found by archaeologists, the Gokstad ship, carried 64 shields, painted alternatively black and yellow. Ship crews were organized rather simply. The steersman or helmsman was the commander aboard, being responsible for law, order, and steering the ship. But what if there was a king or chieftain aboard? Then the helmsman was only responsible for steering, whilst the king claimed all authority. Below the helmsman were 4 officers called reithumen, ready men, each commanding a section of the ship. Cooking and provisions were managed by a bryti. The individual crewmen functioned both as rower and warrior. Some individual ships had age restrictions on who they allowed aboard. One saga mentions a ship that didn't allow anyone younger than 20 or older than 60. At least aboard this ship, the crew were divided into teams of 3. Only one man was needed to row at a time, but in battle, all 3 might have been rowed to speed up the ship, or maybe one blocked his comrade with a shield, one shot at the enemy with a bow, or threw stones, you name it. Now we can get into the nitty-gritty battles themselves. These battles could be absolutely huge. In one battle between Harald Hardrada and Svein Ulfsson, the latter brought 720 ships. In another battle, 180 ships scored off against 360. Note that just because the ships were numerically smaller, it doesn't mean that the ships themselves were small. The lower number of ships might have been bigger ships, and the larger number might have been smaller. And again, these accounts may have been exaggerated propaganda efforts. Other battles were much smaller, 10 ships versus 70, or just 5 versus 11. Still, the scale and maneuvers stands as a testament to their organization, as described previously. Viking sea battles have often been called land battles on the water. The fleets were arranged in lines or wedges. One side or both were customarily roped together to form large, floating platforms. The larger ships with the biggest crews usually formed the middle, with the commander's ship either located in the front or the back. Cargo ships were sometimes positioned at the flanks of the line, since they had higher sides and were harder to board. The prows of the longer ships extended out of the battle line, and some were described as being armored with iron plates called bardi. Others had iron spikes called skägg, meaning beard. However, ramming was never described as being a tactic in Viking warfare. Neither did the Vikings seem to employ the diekplus maneuver, which involves shearing off the oars of an enemy vessel. This would have been very effective. In battle, Viking ships were only propelled by oars. The masts of the warships were detachable and fell down during battle, so cutting the oars would effectively have crippled the ship. Anyway, the iron prows were a defensive measure to keep enemy ships from getting too close and to fend off boarding parties. Smaller and faster ships were deployed as skirmishers outside of the formation, with the task of harassing the enemy. They could bombard them with missiles, outflank and board them from unsuspected angles, reinforce their allied ships, and pursue the enemy in flight. The main tactic was simply to row against an enemy ship, grapple and board it. Boarding action was preceded by a duel with missiles. At long range, this included the bow and arrow. Every levy in the Leithanger was supposed to bring these with him. At closer ranges, they used javelins, wooden stakes shod with iron, and a very underrated and effective weapon called the stone. Even smaller ones could put a serious dent in your helmet, and small boulders could be thrown with both hands at close distances, and even if you block it with your shield, you'd be likely to fall on your ass. If your ship was taller than the enemy's, you could just throw all manners of heavy stuff down on their heads. Due to their frequent mention, effectiveness, and cheap cost, the stone appears to have been a favorite missile of the shipboard Vikings. Against this shower of missiles, the oarsman was protected by a shield bearer. When boarding an enemy ship, it seems as if the attackers struck the defender with the front of their ship and climbed aboard. They might also have come alongside, grappled, and boarded from the side. The goal wasn't necessarily to board and defeat all ships in the enemy fleet, but to find the commanding ships and take them out. The best warriors aboard were deployed as a vanguard. They were the first ones to board the enemy, and as far as I know, were called the forecastle men. Forecastle is the front of the ship. At the Battle of Hafrsfjord, Harald Fairhair deployed 12 berserkers as his vanguard. Just behind him were Harald's handpicked retainers. Levies likely formed a backline, and the commanders seemed to have stayed protected in the back. Vikings did not have a white flag to indicate surrender. Instead, a ship would hoist a red shield at the top of their mast. The red shield was in general used as a symbol for law, order, and peace. Surrendering might not have been optimal, however. Defeated warriors were often forced into thraldom, a sort of slavery similar to medieval serfdom, though not as severe. It's more comparable to the indentured servitude of the early modern era, and thralls could work their way to freedom. Still, you did not want to become a thrall, and it was an effective way of punishing or getting rid of the supporters of your political opponents. When raiding, the Vikings' targets could never be sure where the Vikings would land, since their light ships could beach pretty much anywhere. They preferred to do so on small islands or in the curve of a river, where the ships could be concealed. The ships were usually protected by fortified encampments and garrisoned, in order to secure a safe retreat in event of a disaster. Sometimes, land forces were the one attacking the ships. One of the sagas tells us of Olaf Höskuldsson, who sailed from Norway to Ireland, where his ship got stuck in the mud of the shallow waters of a coast. The Irish came out to the ship, and since the crew of the ship were Norse, the Irish asked him to relinquish all their goods for landing their ship there. Olaf admitted that this was lawful, but despite saying that his men were peaceful, he claimed they would not surrender their cargo without a fight. The Irish gave their battle cry and waded out into the ankle-deep waters to drag the ship ashore. Olaf's men grabbed their weapons and lined themselves along the gunwale. They stood so tightly that there was barely any space between the shields, and the spears jutting out from below them. Olaf was dressed in a chainmail coat and a gilded helmet, a golden sword, a richly decorated hooked spear, and a red shield on which was painted a golden lion. The sight of the braced enemy forced the Irish to retreat, and this would have been like attacking a fortress. The battle resorted to a sort of skirmish, where the Irish pelted the ship from the shore with bows and javelins, until the king himself arrived and negotiated a treaty. If you enjoy the content I produce, consider supporting me monetarily on Patreon. You'll find the link in the video description. Otherwise, please give the video a like and a comment, so that YouTube will show it to more potential viewers. And why not share it with a friend? Cheers.